So I'd just like to begin by thanking the Itelmen people of Siberia, who this story comes from. And unfortunately, their language is already not spoken anymore. So, you know, when a language dies, so much local knowledge and stories die with it. But this is one of the ones that was translated before that happened. Once there was a man named Coot. Now, Coot was mean, selfish, and lazy. He spent most of his days lying on a comfortable bed covered with animal furs in the corner of his yaranga, his tent, and ordering around his son, Coot. Now, Coot was as different to Coot as it was possible to be, where Coot was mean, Coot was kind and generous. Where Coot was lazy, Coot was hard-working. Every morning, Coot would get up, he'd go out into the forest, and he'd gather something to eat for the day, whatever was in season at that time of year. He'd go hunting, but he never took more than was needed, and he always gave thanks. And then he would bring back his haul and cook a delicious meal for himself and his father to share. Now, one day, Coot was walking in the forest when he heard a sound. At first he thought, could it be the wind whispering in the leaves? And then he thought, maybe it's a strange kind of bird that he hadn't heard before. But the more he listened, the more human that voice sounded. And as he looked, he saw a clearing, and on the other side of the clearing, a figure took shape from out of the trees. And it was the figure of a woman, and she was singing. Her skin was the color of the birch bark. Her hair was the color of the old pine needles on the forest floor, and her eyes were the green of the fresh new pine needles. Coot felt a strange feeling coming over his body. Before he knew what was happening, he'd walked over that clearing, he'd gone down on one knee and he'd asked her to marry him. Dating was much simpler in those days. She said, Coot, I've been watching you. I know that you're a good person. You always practice the right rituals at the right times. You always give thanks. I will not refuse you, but you must understand this. I am a creature of the forest. I am not easily domesticated. If you take me home with you, I will bring you suffering. Coot thought about this for a few minutes. He tried to weigh up this kind of suffering, future suffering with this beautiful woman in front of him. He couldn't do it. He said, oh, I'll deal with that later. No, just come and be with me, please. So she did. They went home together. And when the two of them arrived in the entrance to the yaranga, the old man Coot, who was lying on the bed, he sat up. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. He'd never seen anybody so beautiful. He leapt up. He came running over to the woman. He said, Mom, welcome to our humble abode. Can I take your shoes? Would you like some tea? I'll put the kettle on now. Would you perhaps like something to eat? What can I do for you? Coot had never seen his father move so fast. Coot was just falling over himself to do things for this forest woman. And in the back of his mind, the cogs were already turning. Coot was already planning how he could get rid of his son and have this beautiful woman for himself. Well, time passed, and one day, Coot came up to Coot and he said, Son, let's go to hunt bear. It's been a long time since any of our people have caught a bear, and think how long we could eat from the meat of that creature and how many people we could feed. And I've heard that there's a new layer of bears, a family of bears living in the cave up on the mountain. So Coot agreed. He got everything ready. He sharpened his spear, and the two of them set off. As they climbed up the mountain, as they came closer and closer to the cave where the bears lived, Coot started to shake and tremble. He said, "Oh, my son, I seem to have lost my courage with my old age. I'm not as brave as I used to be. Would you mind being the one to go in first?" Coot shrugged. He started to creep towards the cave with his spear held low. And just as he stepped inside the entrance, Coot came running up behind him, gave him a shove, sending him tumbling into the nest of bears. Coot turned and ran back down the mountain, back to the tent, thinking now he could get that beautiful woman for himself. As Coot arrived in the entrance to the Uranga, he looked over and he saw the beautiful body of the forest woman as if it was laid out waiting for him. He ran over and threw himself down on the bed next to her, but ow! Her skin sprouted stinging nettles and he was stung all over. He said, "Why are you covered in needles?" She said, "Why did you push my husband into the bear's den?" He said, so you know about that then? Well, you might as well forget about him. You might as well take me instead. He's probably in the bear's stomachs by now. But Coot was not in the bear's stomachs. The bears were friends of his wife, the forest woman. The bears knew that Coot had always respected the forest. They gave him a feast of their own bear flesh, and then they sent him home well fed and rested. When Coot arrived back in the entrance to the tent, Coot's eyes nearly popped out of his head again. What was his son doing back from the dead, apparently? He ran off into the forest to hide in shame, and he started to plot how he could get rid of his son. He started to come up with a new plan. After 3 days, Coot returned, and the three of them lived together slightly awkwardly for a while. But, time heals all these things. And before long, Coot had forgiven his father. He was a very kind and forgiving young man. And time passed until one day, Coot came to his son and he said, "Son, let's go fishing. Down at the lake, I've heard there's a particularly good catch at the moment." This lake was a particularly deep and dangerous one, need I add. So Coot gathered together his fishing gear, his lines, and his poles, and together they set off to the lake. And when they got there, Coot cast out his first line, and just as the line was hitting the water, Coot came up behind him, gave him a shove, sending Coot tumbling into the lake. The young man's heavy boots dragged him down, down, down to the bottom of the lake. Coot turned and ran back to that Uranga. Now he would have that woman. Now he'd be able to get his hands on her. He burst into the tent. There she was, lying there beautiful. He threw himself down next to her, but ow! She was covered in thorns. "Why are you covered in thorns?" He was scratched and bleeding. He said, "What's going on?" She said, "Why did you push my husband into the lake?" "Well, you might as well forget about him. He's probably drowned. Just take me instead." But Coot was not drowned. Those fish that lived at the bottom of the lake, the great salmon and the trout, they welcomed him into their home. They gave him a feast of their own fish flesh. And then they helped him, carried him back to the surface, helped him onto the banks of the lake. And so, for the second time, Coot turned up in the doorway of the Uranga. Coot couldn't believe his eyes, his son back from the dead. He ran off into the forest to sulk and plot for 3 days. When Coot came back, the three of them carried on their life once again, a little bit more awkward. But still, after a while, time passed, Coot forgave and forgot. One day, Coot said to his son, "Let's go to hunt sable." Sable, the coat of sable is used to make expensive fur coats. It's very warm and rich for the winter. So they went out, they prepared all their things and set off through the forest. And as they walked, the sun filtered through the pine needles and the birch leaves. And after a while, Coot started to hang back a little way. A couple of days earlier, he'd been out in the forest and he dug a pit. A great pit in the middle of the path where he planned to walk, and he'd covered it with branches and leaves so that it was hard to see. Coot stepped onto those branches and sank down deep into the pit. Coot started to push the earth on top of his son, pushing the earth until Coot was completely buried. Coot turned and ran back to the Uranga. But Coot still did not die. The earth was the friend of his wife, the forest woman, and it helped him to climb his way out. It gave support under his feet and under his arms as he pushed and pulled and struggled. It gave him breathing space. After hours, all night, Coot struggled in that earth. And it was the next morning when he dragged himself out, lay there panting on the forest floor, exhausted. He appeared back in the entrance to the Uranga. Earth on his skin, dirt in his ears, beetles crawling in his hair, worms falling from his body. He said, 3 times. 3 times you've tried to kill me, and 3 times I've come back. Now it's your turn. Now it's your turn to come into the forest with us, as I went with you. The forest woman stood up and came and stood beside him. And the two of them took Coot into the forest. And the forest woman spoke the language of the animals of the forest, of the beasts, and she called them by name. And they came, the bear, the wolf, the lynx, the fox. They came and they made a ring, and in the center of that ring, Coot, the old man, trembled. And the forest woman spoke. She said, "You, human, you think you can own me. You cannot own me any more than you can own the wind as it blows through the pine needles, the rain as it falls on the forest floor. I am made of breath that was drawn before your ancestors stepped onto this land. Glaciers carved my body from rock. The stones sang me into being. The sun gave birth to me. My skin is thin, it peels like birch, and under it the rings of centuries. I sweat, sap, my roots split the earth's core, and I breathe out the sky." And then she gave a signal, and those beasts leapt onto Coot, and they tore him to pieces. And as Coot watched, as Coot saw his father being torn into pieces, he found such a howl coming out of his mouth. He found himself sinking into a different kind of dark pit. He rolled on the floor, he clawed at his hair, at his eyes. His fingernails were filled with his own blood as he scratched at his skin. What have I done? And when Coot started to emerge from the pit of his despair, the forest woman was there. She took him by the hand. The two of them went back to that Uranga that had been their home. They took out the bed that had belonged to Coot and they burnt it. And then they cleaned everything. They scrubbed and cleaned the hut from top to bottom. And then they went out. They watched the sunset together. And they faced their future together as husband and wife, with love and with respect.